Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is a certain expectation of precision.
Right, absolutely.
Like, it feels like engineering in a way. If you fall off a bike and you break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an x-ray, and there's this jagged white line on a black background.
Yeah. And the doctor just points to it and says, there's the problem. It's incredibly comforting when things are that binary.
Right, broken or not broken.
Exactly. We naturally gravitate toward things that can be neatly categorized and made visible.
But the moment you step into the world of mental health, specifically looking at things like neurodevelopment, chronic stress, depression, that trusty x-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Completely useless.
We are suddenly navigating this diagnostic landscape that is honestly incredibly murky. I mean, for the longest time, the mainstream narrative treated severe stress and depression as a purely psychological phenomena.
Right.
Or, at best, a very simple equation where, a chemical imbalance of serotonin just magically equals a bad mood.
And that oversimplification has really held us back, honestly, because the reality of what is happening inside the skull during periods of profound stress is vastly more physical.
Yeah.
And infinitely more complex than just feeling overwhelmed. The emotional distress is real, obviously, but it is accompanied by a literal cellular demolition derby.
Which is exactly the territory we are exploring today. Welcome to this deep dive into the very physical biology of stress.
Glad to be here.
And rather than just guessing, we are pulling from an incredible stack of recent scientific literature for you today. We're digging into the Salk Institute's bold new initiative declaring 2026 their year of brain health.
Which is a huge deal.
It is. Plus, we have a massive, comprehensive 2023 review from Frontiers in Psychiatry that maps out exactly how inflammation breaks down the brain.
And we're also looking at a really fascinating 2009 study from Frontiers in Neuroscience. That one reveals the literal physical mechanics of how behaviors like exercise and learning can actually grow the brain back.
Right. So the overarching mission for us today is to trace that exact biological pathway. We want to uncover the precise mechanics of how a psychological stressor physically dismantles your neural circuitry.
Exactly. And crucially, we want to look at how targeted everyday behaviors alongside some really cutting-edge emerging therapeutics can reverse that damage.
And this matters because every single one of you listening to this right now experiences stress. I mean, we all deal with the wear and tear of modern life.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And we all want to maintain our cognitive resilience as we age. So today, you're going to get the blueprint for exactly what is happening inside your head on a microscopic level when you're stressed.
And, more importantly, how to fight back.
Okay, let's unpack this. We always hear that stress is, quote unquote, bad for the brain. But how does a psychological feeling actually translate into physical cellular damage?
Well, to really grasp the mechanics of that, we have to completely change how we view the brain itself. And this is where the Salk Institute's 2026 initiative is so vital. They are actively pushing a totally new paradigm for brain health. Because traditionally, medical science has looked at the brain in isolation.
Right, like it's cut off from the rest.
Exactly. And they usually wait until a severe disease like Alzheimer's or, major cognitive decline appears before trying to treat the symptoms. Salk is flipping that entirely.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, they're focusing on foundational prevention across the human lifespan well before the disease ever even manifests.
So reading through their initiative, what really struck me is their emphasis on the rest of the body. Like, they aren't looking at the brain in a vacuum at all.
No, not at all.
They've built these interdisciplinary think tanks, bringing together immunologists, cardiovascular experts, computational biologists, all to study how systemic bodily health dictates brain health.
Because the brain is arguably the most demanding organ in the human body. I mean, Salk's approach recognizes that you just cannot have a healthy brain without strong peripheral systems supporting it.
That makes a lot of sense.
For instance, they are heavily targeting cardiovascular fitness because robust aerobic health directly supports the energy-producing mitochondrial pathways in the brain.
Okay, so the heart feeds the brain's energy.
Exactly. They're also mapping immune health to understand how your diet and how everyday pathogens shape your baseline inflammation.
Right.
And they're looking really closely at metabolic health simply because stable glucose levels are absolutely required to prevent chronic, low-grade inflammation from just simmering in your bloodstream.
Reading all this, I found myself thinking about the brain like a highly fortified city.
Oh, I like that.
Because for centuries, we treated the brain like it was this magical, isolated, walled garden that just existed independently from the neck down. But a city's survival completely depends on its supply lines.
Yeah.
Like the cardiovascular system is the highway bringing in fresh supplies. The immune and metabolic systems act as like the waste management and border patrol.
Right.
So if the supply chains get poisoned, or if the waste starts piling up outside the gates, the city is going to fall, no matter how thick those walls are.
That analogy actually scales perfectly to the cellular level. I mean, if we accept that the brain relies entirely on those peripheral supply chains, we can start to see how a systemic issue like chronic, everyday stress can mount a literal invasion.
Which brings us to the breach. Like, how does a fortified biological wall actually break down?
Yeah.
The 2023 Psychiatry Review goes incredibly deep into this mechanism, starting with something called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Yeah, and this is where the physical translation actually begins. Whether that's, a toxic work environment, financial panic, a major trauma, your HPA axis gets locked in overdrive.
It just doesn't shut off.
Right. It starts pumping out massive, continuous amounts of the stress hormone cortisol.
Now, in short bursts, cortisol is actually highly anti-inflammatory, right?
Yeah, it is. It temporarily suppresses the immune system to save energy for immediate survival. But when your body is flooded with it for weeks or months on end, the system just breaks.
Yeah. The review notes that the immune cells essentially become numb to it. They develop what they call glucocorticoid receptor resistance.
Imagine a fire alarm ringing constantly in a building for a month straight.
You just ignore it eventually.
Exactly. Eventually, the occupants just tune it out and go about their day. And your immune cells do the exact same thing. They stop listening to the cortisol.
Wow.
And without cortisol acting as the brakes, those peripheral immune cells become hyperactive and just deeply confused. They start releasing these endogenous danger signals.
Which are essentially cellular SOS flares, right?
Yeah, they're called DAMPs, or damage-associated molecular patterns, things like S100B, heat shock proteins, galectin-3.
Okay, rather than getting bogged down in the alphanumeric names of every specific molecule, because that gets dense, the big takeaway from the review is that these SOS flares send a message to the body's pattern recognition receptors that something is critically wrong. The body genuinely thinks it is under physical attack, even if you are just, sitting at your desk stressed about an email.
And that perceived attack triggers a massive systemic response. Those pattern recognition receptors, things like NLRP3 and TLR4, they trigger an absolute avalanche of pro-inflammatory cytokines.
Which are like the foot soldiers, right?
Exactly. You can think of cytokines, specifically IL-1 beta, IL-6, and TNF-alpha, as the foot soldiers of the immune system. They flood into the bloodstream, creating a highly toxic, inflammatory environment throughout the entire body.
And this is where the city walls come under direct assault. These circulating cytokines eventually reach the blood-brain barrier.
They do.
We hear about this barrier a lot. It is supposed to be this incredibly selective filter that only lets nutrients in and keeps toxins out.
Right, that's its job.
But the review explains that these inflammatory foot soldiers physically degrade that barrier. Like they dissolve the critical tight junction proteins, specifically things like claudin-5 and occludin.
Yeah. The tight junctions are literally the mortar holding the bricks of the barrier together. As those inflammatory cytokines wash over the barrier, the mortar begins to dissolve.
The wall actually gets leaky.
Yes. And as the structural integrity fails, larger aggressive immune cells from the body called macrophages start seeping through the cracks.
And the review mentions that once these macrophages reach the barrier, they secrete highly acidic enzymes, matrix metalloproteinases, that further chew through the tissue, forcefully wedging their way into the central nervous system.
It's a very violent process on a cellular level.
So just to pause and reflect on this causal chain. Wait. So stress isn't just making you feel tired or overwhelmed. It is literally acting as a chemical battering ram that breaks down the physical wall protecting your brain.
What's fascinating here is exactly that translation from the psychological to the physical. A psychological stressor triggers a hormonal flood, which numbs the immune system,
Right.
which spawns an inflammatory storm, which physically melts the barrier, protecting your central nervous system. The line between peripheral inflammation and neuroinflammation has been completely crossed at that point.
Okay, so the wall is breached. These peripheral immune cells and inflammatory molecules are now flooding into the central nervous system. What do they actually do once they get inside the city?
They incite an absolute riot. The medical term for it is gliosis.
Gliosis, okay.
Yeah. The brain has its own resident immune cells, called microglia, which usually act like peaceful neighborhood watchmen, quietly pruning synapses and keeping things tidy.
Sounds nice.
It is.
Mhm.
Until those invading highly inflammatory cytokines hit the microglia. They cause them to polarize into this toxic, aggressive state called the M1 phenotype.
And what happens then?
These M1 microglia start releasing reactive oxygen species and huge amounts of glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Plus, the astrocytes get damaged too, which you can measure by a drop in a protein called GFAP.
So the neighborhood watchmen turn into arsonists, basically setting fires in the streets. The review also details how this inflammatory chaos hijacks a very critical biological assembly line, the tryptophan pathway.
This is one of the most insidious effects of neuroinflammation. Normally, your brain takes the amino acid tryptophan, which, you get from your diet, and uses it to synthesize serotonin.
Which we all know is crucial for mood regulation, sleep, and just overall stability.
Right. But an inflamed brain releases a specific enzyme called IDO that essentially stages a hostile takeover of that assembly line.
Wow.
It steals the tryptophan, and instead of manufacturing serotonin, it converts into a compound called quinolinic acid, or QUIN.
And quinolinic acid is highly neurotoxic, isn't it?
It is incredibly destructive.
Right.
Quinolinic acid overstimulates the NMDA receptors on the neurons, leading to a state of excitotoxicity.
Which means what exactly?
The neurons are basically revved so high and so hard that they burn out and die. And this completely shatters the brain's delicate excitatory-inhibitory balance. A healthy brain relies on a perfect equilibrium between excitation, getting neurons to fire, and inhibition, calming them down.
But with quinolinic acid flooding the system, the accelerator is just pinned to the floor. And at the exact same time, the inflammation is destroying the very neurons responsible for hitting the brakes. The calming, inhibitory GABA neurons, like the somatostatin-expressing ones.
Exactly. So the neural circuits become incredibly noisy, chaotic, and inefficient. The brain is quite literally damaging its own hardware.
And this cellular noise translates directly into the physical, outward symptoms of severe depression. I mean, the 2023 review highlights a staggering statistic. Up to 27% of patients diagnosed with major depressive disorder actually have measurable chronic neuroinflammation.
Usually marked by a CRP level over 3 milligrams per liter.
Right, and the review describes this as a melancholic phenotype that mimics sickness behavior. People experience profound fatigue, a total lack of motivation, apathy,
And anhedonia, which is the absolute inability to feel pleasure, plus measurable cognitive impairment. Their brain is processing information through a thick fog of inflammation.
Reading this, a huge question came to my mind. Does this mean that for a large subset of people, depression isn't just that classic quote-unquote chemical imbalance of serotonin we've been sold for decades, but actually an autoimmune style response where the brain genuinely thinks it's infected?
The current data points very strongly in that direction.
Yes.
The brain is reacting exactly as it would if it were fighting off a severe, life-threatening infection.
It's in survival mode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is forcefully redirecting resources away from higher-level cognition, mood regulation, and energy production, and pouring everything into this toxic survival response.
That's incredible.
That famous drop in serotonin isn't necessarily the root cause of the depression. It's a byproduct of the brain cannibalizing its own serotonin supply chain to manufacture inflammatory weapons.
That just completely shatters the conventional understanding of mental health.
Yeah.
But I don't want to leave anyone feeling like they're just helpless victims of their own stress hormones.
No, definitely not.
Because while we have seen how stress acts as a wrecking ball, the brain is incredibly dynamic. Going back to the Salk Institute, they heavily emphasize behaviors like exercise as a pillar of brain health.
Yes, they do.
And this brings us to that brilliant 2009 Frontiers in Neuroscience study, which maps out the exact biological antidote to this damage.
It is a beautifully elegant study. The researchers want to understand adult neurogenesis, so the actual physical creation of brand new neurons in the hippocampus, which is the brain's primary center for memory, learning, and emotion.
Right.
They took adult female mice and tested two very distinct lifestyle variables: voluntary physical exercise on a running wheel, which they called RUN, and environmental enrichment, ENR.
Environmental enrichment meaning they put complex structures, toys, and mazes into the enclosures. Basically, they gave the mice novelty and forced them to learn and explore.
Exactly. They were providing cognitive stimulation. And by using a specific chemical marker, BRDU, to tag newly dividing precursor cells in the brain, they were able to track exactly how these two different behaviors affected the physical growth of the brain.
And the distinction they found between the two is profound. Let's break down those mechanics. What exactly did the physical running do to the brain?
The running condition dramatically increased the proliferation of new precursor cells.
Expanding the pool, essentially.
Yes. Physical aerobic exercise literally signaled the brain to manufacture a massive pool of raw, new potential brain cells. But, and this is the critical catch, just because the brain manufactures those cells doesn't mean they automatically survive and integrate into the network.
Right, and that is where the environmental enrichment comes in.
Yeah.
Because the enrichment condition didn't actually create new cells, right?
It didn't. Instead, the cognitive stimulation promoted the survival of those newborn cells. It gave those raw neurons a complex task to figure out, which forced them to wire into the existing neural network and stay alive.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think of your brain like a rapidly expanding company.
Right.
Going for a run is like the HR department aggressively hiring a massive cohort of brand new interns. That's the cell proliferation. You have all this raw potential sitting in the lobby.
Right.
But environmental enrichment, learning a new skill, navigating a complex environment, solving a problem is the equivalent of actually giving those interns meaningful, challenging projects.
Have that.
Because if you just hire a bunch of interns but leave them sitting in an empty room with nothing to do, they get bored, they quit, and they leave, the cells die. You absolutely need both the hiring and the managing to grow the company.
The data supports that analogy flawlessly. When the researchers tested a sequential combination, having the mice engage in 10 days of physical running, immediately followed by 35 days of environmental enrichment, they saw a massive additive effect.
30%, right?
Yes, roughly a 30% greater increase in fully mature, surviving new neurons than either activity did on its own.
So physical activity primes the brain. It builds up this massive biological reservoir of potential, making the brain highly receptive, but you have to follow it up with cognitive challenge to lock those gains in.
Yes. Lifestyle behaviors like rigorous cardiovascular exercise and continuous cognitive learning aren't just abstract good habits. They're the literal mechanical processes by which the brain repairs its hardware and pushes back against the cellular damage of stress.
But this brings up a really tough practical reality. What if a person's brain is already severely compromised?
Yeah, that's the hard part.
I mean, if someone is deeply locked in that sickness behavior state, the crushing fatigue, the severe apathy, the neuroinflammation, they do not have the physical or mental motivation to get out of bed, let alone go for a rigorous 5-mile run and then sit down to study a new language.
And that is the cruelest irony of neuroinflammatory depression. The very mechanisms required to organically heal the brain are disabled by the disease state itself.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. The inflammation cuts off the motivation required to fix the information. This is where the medical frontier becomes so important, because traditional treatments, like standard SSRI antidepressants, often fail these specific patients.
Well, that makes sense based on what we discussed earlier. If your inflamed brain has hijacked the assembly line and is burning through all your tryptophan to make toxic quinolinic acid, an SSRI, which just tries to recycle existing serotonin, isn't going to have any serotonin left to work with.
Precisely. You're trying to fill a pool that has a massive drain open at the bottom. So researchers and psychiatrists are increasingly looking outside traditional psychiatric drugs and turning to systemic anti-inflammatories to treat the mind.
Wow.
The 2023 review highlights several of these emerging approaches. Because monoamine antidepressants take a long time to counter inflammation, one major area of focus right now is COX-2 inhibitors.
Which are standard non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like NSAIDs.
Yes, drugs in the same family as certain common pain relievers, like celecoxib. The review notes clinical trials where pairing a specific COX-2 inhibitor with a standard antidepressant, like sertraline, drastically improved remission rates in treatment-resistant patients.
How does that work?
It works by physically blocking the synthesis of pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. It basically cuts off the fuel supply that is keeping the brain inflamed.
That's incredible. The review also spends a lot of time on omega-3 fatty acids, specifically high-dose EPA, around 4 grams a day. Now, we always hear omega-3s are good for the brain, but the actual mechanism of how they work is wild.
It really is. Omega-3s don't just passively block inflammation. They are actively involved in cleaning it up.
like a cleanup crew.
Yeah, when introduced into the system in high enough doses, they synthesize into these molecules called specialized pro-resolving mediators. You can think of them as a biological chemical fire blanket.
Okay.
They cross into the brain, hunt down those toxic arsonist microglia we talked about, and directly inhibit their activation, forcing the brain to cool down.
It's like sending in a specialized riot squad to disperse the mob and sweep up the debris.
Exactly.
I also noticed the review explicitly mentions statins. Aren't those traditionally used strictly to lower cholesterol?
They are, but certain statins, specifically simvastatin, have profound, potent anti-inflammatory properties that we are just beginning to fully appreciate for mental health.
Really?
Yeah. The review highlights simvastatin because it is highly lipophilic, meaning it dissolves easily in fats.
And because the blood-brain barrier is largely lipid-based?
It can easily slide right through the wall. Once inside the central nervous system, it rescues depressive behaviors by heavily suppressing the specific signaling pathways like NF-κB and IL-1 beta that keep the cytokine storm raging.
Wow. And for the most extreme cases where the patient's baseline inflammation is just off the charts, the review discusses targeted anti-cytokine therapies.
Yes.
They're using drugs like infliximab, which is a monoclonal antibody against TNF-alpha. These were originally designed for severe autoimmune diseases like Crohn's, right?
Right. Or rheumatoid arthritis. They act like heat-seeking missiles designed to hunt down and neutralize very specific inflammatory cytokines before they can even breach the brain.
So, hearing all this, there is a natural leap in logic someone might make. So, what does this all mean for the listener? Are we saying people should start raiding the medicine cabinet, popping cholesterol meds and heavy doses of Advil to cure a bad mood?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, absolutely not.
Right. Good to clarify.
These are powerful, targeted medical interventions meant for diagnosed severe chronic neuroinflammation, not everyday sadness. Playing around with systemic immune suppressants without a doctor is a terrible idea.
Definitely.
The conceptual takeaway from this medical frontier is undeniable. Systemic body health is mental health. The physical health of your immune and cardiovascular systems dictates the psychological health of your mind.
Which brings us perfectly full circle back to the Salk Institute's 2026 vision. I mean, we now have a cohesive biological narrative of brain health. We started with Salk's systemic premise. The understanding that your cardiovascular highways and metabolic waste management systems are what keep the fortified city of the brain secure.
Wow.
We mapped the cellular destruction of stress, watching how a chronic flood of cortisol forces the immune system to panic, summoning an inflammatory cytokine storm that literally physically melts the blood-brain barrier.
And we saw how that breach leads to toxic gliosis, right? Hijacking the brain's serotonin factory and replacing it with a neurotoxic environment that creates profound sickness behavior.
But we also explored the biological antidote. We have the data proving that cardiovascular exercise literally manufactures new brain cells, and environmental enrichment wires them into place.
And for those whose walls are completely overrun, science is developing targeted medicines to calm the peripheral immune system so the brain can finally begin to heal.
The ultimate takeaway for you today is that your brain is not a static, isolated organ that just sits in the dark and passively endures the stress of your life.
No, it's highly dynamic.
It is a physical landscape that is actively rewiring and rebuilding itself every single day based on your systemic health. Cardiovascular fitness, managing your immune health, running, learning complex new things. These aren't just optional bullet points on a self-improvement checklist.
They're essential.
They are literal biological shields that you construct to protect your blood-brain barrier from the toxic byproducts of modern stress.
By understanding the exact physical mechanics of your stress, you're finally empowered to mechanically dismantle it.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Oh, I'm curious.
We learned from that fascinating 2009 mouse study that physical exercise creates a massive pool of new brain cells, but cognitive novelty and enrichment are absolutely required to keep them alive.
Right.
Now, take a look at modern fitness culture. Think about millions of people spending hours running on treadmills, staring blankly at a gym wall, and then immediately following up that workout by sitting on a couch, mindlessly doom-scrolling on social media in highly routine, unenriching environments.
Wow.
Are we biologically manufacturing millions of brilliant, raw, new brain cells through our physical exercise, only to let them immediately die off because we fail to give our brains the novelty, the challenge, and the complex enrichment required to sustain them?
That is a staggering concept.
Yeah.
And definitely something worth thinking about during your next workout.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep challenging yourself, and keep building that biological shield.